So I want you to know these are ancient stories. I didn't invent them. I am not responsible for the content, but these are very definitely not stories being told by Walt Disney or Ladybird. Is there any children there? Are there anybody with sensitive ears? Please say no, please. I mean, I don't think there's anything inappropriate or unpleasant in these stories, but perhaps I should say, cover your ears. Now, the stories I'm going to tell tonight, it's such a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to say them, because these are stories that take me back to my childhood. We spent, as a family, we had a few family holidays in Ireland in a great crumbling mansion with an Anglo-Irish family that had lived there for 400 years. And even at that time, it seemed like it was an anachronism. What were they doing there? How were they living there? I mean, how could they even keep the roof on their heads? And they had the children had an Irish nanny. I mean, nanny, not a sort of prim starch nanny, somebody who helped with the children. And she used to tell us bedtime stories. And the stories that I'm going to tell are ones that I remember from her tales. And they take me back to this strange world. It's funny because even then, when I was there in the 70s, it seemed like that world of sort of faded gentility was in its way out. And I think it's gone now. I mean, that family, when the parents who were friends of my parents died, their children were all in England, and nobody wanted the house, and it was sold, and now they live in Surrey. And one of them lives in Surrey, and one of them lives just outside Basingstoke. It's not quite the same. What shall we start with? Once upon a time, long, long ago, in Clonmel, in County Tipperary, a child was born to the O'Dwyer family. It was the 5th child, and he was named Paddy after his grandfather. All children are a blessing. Some children are less of a blessing than others, and I'm afraid that Paddy O'Dwyer, well, he was a blessing to the family. His mother loved him, and his father loved him, and his brothers and his sisters loved him, and some of his uncles and aunts, but, well, he was born with a great hump, and he was more of the crunched up, scrunched up spider than a man or a boy. And perhaps it was because of his childhood all alone, when no one would speak to him really, and no one wanted anything to do with him, but he spent it much in the woods and out in the countryside. And perhaps it was because of that or something else that people said he was with the good people or had a special affection for them. And he was consulted by some people on their problems, and if the cow was sick or if there was something that couldn't be explained, and sometimes he was helpful. But I'm not sure that he was really in league with the good people then, because, well, as you'll find out, if he was in league with the good people, I don't think I wouldn't be telling this story now. Now, he had a way with his hands, and he made the finest corn dollies and hats and baskets for miles around. And everywhere he went, he wore a little sprig of the fairies' hat, which is, what we call the foxglove. Perhaps that is also why. One summer, he went to the great fair that was always held in Cashel on Midsummer's Eve. And he did very good business, selling his hats and his baskets, did better than he'd perhaps ever done before, but he always did well, and people always would pay a premium for good work, even if they didn't like to look at him and didn't like to touch him or have anything to do with him, but they would buy the thing. And he set off to walk home. Now, it's a long way from Cashel to Clonmel, especially if you walk over the knock-me-down mountains. It may or may not be the quickest route. But it was late. And just perhaps coincidentally, at the beginning of the witching hour, he thought he would stop, and he went up onto the mound that's called around there St. Patrick's Mound, but I think others know it as a fairy mound. And he went up there to sit down and take a breath and prepare himself for the long walk home. He hadn't been walking there, he hadn't been sitting there long, when he heard a noise, a murmur of voices, and it seemed to be coming out of a little hole in the great slab on the top of the mound. Putting his ear to it, he could hear voices, and then the noise was loud, and he took his ear away, and he could hear, and then a singing of a song. But the song wasn't quite finished. It was repeated and repeated and repeated, and seemed to be missing a bit. And then, without knowing where, and without meaning to, and without even controlling his voice, he suddenly found himself singing with them. But more than that, he sang, and he sang on and took the song to new places. And they sang too. And all of a sudden he felt himself picked up as if in a whirlwind and thrown up into the air, and he was terrified. And then he felt himself being thrown down with a great force towards the great slab, the sacrificial slab, and he thought his head was going to be smashed into smithereens. But as his head got to the slab, he felt himself shrunk and squished and pushed, and he went right through the tiny hole and found himself in fairyland. Now, let me tell you, everything you've ever heard about fairyland is true. It is a strange place and a wonderful place, and the rivers are full of silver, and the boulders are all of gold. And there was a party carrying on, and they were right pleased to see him, and they gave him to drink, and he danced and he drank, and he thought it was odd, for he'd never danced like this. And yet in fairyland he didn't feel his hump. And he had a lovely time. Perhaps he might have drunk a little bit too much, because he didn't remember quite what happened. But in the morning he awoke, alone, with a head that was a little bit sore, on the slab. And he stood up, except it wasn't really a standing up. It was more of an uncoiling. He'd never stood right the way up before. and he realized his hump had gone, and the strange muscles and things he'd had in the wrong places now came out into the right places, and he was a tall, strong man. And he marched home and no one recognized him, and he had to explain and explain again and again and again what had happened with his hump. It was a miracle. Now I must take you to another family, the MacDonalds in Ulster. Well, I'm not going to say what I think of those sorts of people. I think we all know. And I know that it's all supposed to be the same God in different ways, but it's not, is it really? And you can't expect any good to the man named Oliver. Perhaps it was that he didn't receive the love from his family that young Paddy had. But he was born with a hump, and perhaps his parents and his siblings were a little bit disgusted. Or perhaps he was bad and nasty from the start. But his godmother, well, she died soon after he was born, and she didn't live to see what a horror he was. And she left him her house, and they all lived in that house. So they all had to put up with that horror. When the story got to Ulster and his mother heard it, she said, I hope Oliver doesn't hear it. Well, Oliver did hear it, and he wouldn't stop talking about it, and he sent his mother off to Tipperary to find out if it was true, and she got there and everyone told her the story was true, but she thought perhaps they were making game of her. So she went to, well, they call them in the Church of Ireland, they call them vicars, and I suppose they might be honest, I don't know. But she went and he said, yes, it was true, but she wasn't to go and talk to Paddy O'Dwyer. He must be in league with the good people and no good could come of that, could it? She should stay away. Well, she went to see Paddy O'Dwyer and he told her the whole story. And when Oliver heard the story, he said, next midsummer I will be at the fairy mound. So they took him there and they left him as instructed. Come the witching hour, he heard the singing, and I'll say this for Oliver. He had a good voice. And he sang a song, well, not a song which was popular in Ulster, but perhaps not so popular elsewhere. And perhaps if he had had half a brain, he wouldn't have sung it there. And it certainly was not popular with the good people. He felt himself picked up and taken into the air, and he was very excited because he thought, great, they're going to push me down into fairyland and take my hump away. And as he felt himself being propelled down at great speed towards the great sacrificial rock, he could see the little hole, and he thought how much fun it would be to squeeze all tight and pop through it. But that's not what happened at all. In the morning, his family came, and really it was more like a raspberry jam they found, and bits of blood and bone all over the sacrificial stone. I don't want to say that they didn't miss him, but, well, they lived happily ever after.